What's up? It's Jen Brown. Welcome back to my channel. Today I've got a really fun tutorial for you. I was really excited about this striped top and I honestly couldn't wait to make it in more colors to do this tutorial. So let's go ahead and get started. This one's a little bit more complicated just because of all the different colors than the tutorials I usually do. These are the colors that I'm going to be using. Obviously use whatever colors you want, but just to make this easy, or at least easier for me to kind of explain, I'm just going to go ahead and go through the pattern that I did. Obviously customize as much as you like. So for this pattern I'm using 5 different colors. I've got, let's do them in order. I've got the first main color. This is going to be the color that we use for the trim along the bottom and on the cuffs. The second main color is this magenta color. Sorry, my tails are all kind of tangled up here. This is the one that we're going to be using for the sleeves. Then I have a marled color just to give something, or you could call it speckled, I guess, just to give it a little bit more interest going on than just using plain colors. Then I've got a light color. This one has a little bit of a pattern in it too, but I just wanted something that was lighter than the rest. And then I have what I'm calling an accent color. You will need a little bit more than this. This is just the leftovers of something else I'm working with right now. This is the color that's going to show up least in the project. So to start this out, I'm going to make a foundation chain for as wide as I want this to be. For me, that's going to be 50 chains. I want this to be a little bit more fitted. Now my first row is going to be single crochets. And I will put up along the side here a nice chart that shows my color pattern. That way, if you want to follow it, you can pause and write it down or see it. But if you want to do your own thing, or just so you don't have to sit here and watch me every single time I change colors, you can take a look at that and see what I'm doing for the color pattern. This stripe pattern is going to be a combination of half double crochets and single crochets. So for me, I'm going to repeat part of this pattern twice to make this top as long as I want. But if you need to repeat it a third time, if you want this to be longer or shorter if you need to, or obviously just totally change up the pattern if you want. But this pattern that I have, this chart that I've made, takes this all the way from my shoulder to just about at my natural waist. With the trim along the bottom, this top has a slight crop to it. If it helps, just a little tip I have, whether you're making your own pattern or trying to follow this one, this was for the first version of this top, and I just made myself a little swatch just to make sure I even liked it before I started. So if you're making your own, I recommend this, so that way if you decide you don't like it, you don't have to pull out the whole thing. Okay, now I've got the front side finished up to where I want the bottom of the neckline to be. So we're making this a square neck. So we're going to continue with the pattern, but just in a shorter section to do the first shoulder. So I finished off this row. Do my turning chain like normal. Then I'm just going to crochet as far in as I want this to go. I thought I could talk and count at the same time. I should have known better. For me, that was 16 chains. So now, instead of continuing on, I'm just going to turn here and finish off the pattern for this shoulder. So I've stopped. This is the beginning of where I started to repeat the pattern, so I'm just going to finish the pattern only doing these 16 chains. And like I said, I'm just finishing off the pattern. I'm going to leave that just for a second. Once you're finished with that and you're ready to come back to the other side, you will just tie on to this end. And do the same thing we just did. So I'm just going to complete the pattern on both sides to create that square neckline, and then we'll move on to the next step of stitching them both the sides together. Alright, so I've got the back and the front finished. Now it is time to stitch these together. I decided I think that will be easier to do that first before I go through and tie off all the ends, so that way I'm not like trying to work a stitch through a bunch of knots. So I've got my pieces together. There's not really an inside versus an outside at the moment, so I'm just picking one. Make sure your patterns are lined up unless you want the back to be different from the front. We're gonna start by just stitching up the shoulders. It doesn't really matter what color you use. I'm just gonna use my orange because that's what I have the most of, but any of the colors really will work. So I'll start by slip stitching together both the shoulders, and then up the side I'm gonna go to about here. It's about halfway, a little more than halfway. That's just what I know from the original sweater that I made, that I like that length. But again, hold this up to yourself, you know, decide this is going to be the armhole, so how big you want the armhole to be. Okay, so I've got the shoulders and the sides stitched together. Again, I left these for now because I don't want to have to be like working the sleeve into a bunch of knots. So I'll try my best to kind of get these out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. So the next step I'm going to do is the sleeve. So we're going to be using our second main color, which is the pink in this case. Okay, so now that we're ready to start the sleeve, I've got my pink yarn and I have slip stitched to join near the armpit. Then I'm going to make a row of single crochets all the way around the armhole just to make adding the sleeve a little bit easier. Alright, so I've got this row of single crochets done, and I trimmed off the ends and tied them off so it's a little easier to see what's going on. So all I did was slip stitch to join. Back to the front of this row. Now we'll start the sleeve. So I'm going to chain 22. Then I'm going to chain 2 more. Then do a row of half double crochets. But we're going to do something a little bit different when we join this back to the side of the sweater. So don't join those just yet. I'll meet you down there. Okay. So normally, when I'm trying to make a sleeve, I would line this up and slip stitch to join 2 chains away, kind of where it would line up perfectly to match and kind of lay flat. But because we're trying to make this a puff sleeve and I want to create some ruching around the shoulder, we're actually going to slip stitch to join this in the next chain that we started from. Then I'm just going to chain 1 more, slip stitch to chain 1 more into the next row, then do another row of half double crochets. So we're cramming a bigger stitch from our row into smaller spaces, if that makes sense. So that's going to kind of bunch it together here and start to create some ruching and give us the start of that volume for the puff sleeve. So now that I've done a few rows, you can start to see that it is tapering in and getting smaller and a little bit more scrunched up where it meets the side of the armhole. And you can see on the first one how that has started to like create just a little bit of ruching. So I'm going to do this all the way around. Like I said, it'll be about 68 rows because I'm doing the same amount. I'm doing 1 row of half double crochets per chain. Then I'm going to do the same process to the other side. And then we'll work on how to make the cuffs. Okay, so now that I've got the sleeve finished, maybe zoomed in a little too far, I just slip stitched the 2 ends together to finish off the sleeve. So now, before we do the cuff, we're going to do a couple rows of single crochets around this that's going to start cinching it in, and just to add like some stripe to the sleeve as well. So you're going to take your lighter color, so that's the yellow, and the way we're going to start increasing is every 4 stitches you're going to decrease by stitching 2 together. So I do 1, 2, 3, and then if you don't know how to do 2 stitches together, I'm going to do half of this single crochet, and then instead of yarning over and finishing the stitch, I'm going to put my hook into the next chain and finish off both of those together. So that's cinching 2 of the previous row stitches into one. So I'm going to do that on every fourth one around. That's going to give me about 70 chains for this row. If it's not exactly that, that's okay, but it's going to be about that many. Then when I'm finished, I'm just going to slip stitch to join, trim, then switch to your marled or your speckled color, so that's the blue for me. You can either tie it on or just start your chain with the new color, whichever way is easier. Then we're going to do the same thing, continuing to decrease every 4, and that should get you to, I think for me it's around 53 chains. Okay, now we're ready to start the cuff. So we can trim that. Tie it off if you want, and then we're going to go to our first main color, which is the purple. Slip stitch to join. Then we're going to chain 7. Then do 6 slip stitches. Then just like with our sleeve, we're going to slip stitch into the next blue chain to join, then slip stitch in the next blue to start the next row. Then we're going to back loop slip stitch into this to create a ribbed cuff that will look like this when you're finished. And that really, because we're doing slip stitches and they're back loops, that is really going to cinch this in. I recommend, if you're not sure how tight this is going to be on your arm, I can usually kind of figure that out when I'm about halfway through. So I will do about half of a sleeve and then kind of hold it up to my arm, and I can usually tell if it's too tight or not. So if it's your first time doing something like this, I would kind of recommend that, because you may have to make this a little bit bigger or go to single crochets for your cuff if it's too tight on your arm. So I'm just going to it's a little dark and a little funky for you to see what I'm doing, but we're back loop slip stitching all the way around, and then when we reach the end point, I will just slip stitch these, the front and the back ends together, to close it off just like I did with the sleeve. Alright, so we've got the cuff of the sleeve done. Normally I would have both. I need to get some more of this yarn. I have this much of this sleeve left and ran out of the pink, so I got to go get some more of that today, but I do have this cuff done. So now it's time, whoops, now it's time to just finish off the neckline, and then we'll do the cuff around the bottom. So we're almost finished. So for this, I'm just doing a row of single crochets all the way around. If you don't want to, That got quite stretched out up there. You don't necessarily have to go across the back, but I like to just because it makes these corners look really nice. So we're using, you could really use any color, but I wanted it to be like a nice border with the purple where it ends here, so I'm going to be using the purple. So as usual, I'm just going to make a loop on my hook, slip stitch to join, chain 1, and then just single crochet. You can really start this anywhere, I'm just starting it across the back. So I'm coming up here, these are kind of in the way. My corner stitch is right here. So what I'm gonna do, like we talked about when we were decreasing for the arm, is I'm gonna decrease by starting my single crochet in the next loop, starting it again in the corner, then starting one more time in the next, and then yarning over and pulling through all of those at once. So I'm putting, instead of decreasing by putting 2 stitches together, we just put 3 stitches together. So once again, we're at this corner. There's a lot happening here because of the color changing. So I'm going to put my hook, come on, through the stitch right before the corner, yarn over once, put it into the corner stitch, yarn over once, then the one on the other side of the corner, yarn over once, then yarn over and pull through all 4 loops. And that will give us this nice looking corner. So I'll do that for the other 2 corners, meet back up, slip stitch to join, and then we'll be ready to start the, is it still a cuff if it's at the hem? I don't know. Let me know what you think, but the hem of the top. Alright, so we are ready to do the hem. We're also going to be using the purple, your first main color. We're going to do this just like we did the cuffs on the sleeves, but with single crochets instead. The slip stitches just, I find, cinch it in too much. If you want this to be like really cropped and also kind of like cinched in and poofy at the waist, go for it, but I want this to just kind of lay flat but still have that ribbed effect, so that's why we're doing single crochets. So I've slip stitched to join, and I'm going to chain 8. That 8th chain will be my turning chain, so I'll do 7 single crochets, slip stitch in the next pink chain to join, slip stitch in the next pink chain to start the next row, flip, and then 7 back loop single crochets, stitch to join, slip stitch to start the new row, and then I will just repeat this all the way around, and then we'll be finished.